There are nights when a city doesn't quite sleep. It glows instead, under office lights left on by habit, under street lamps that hum over empty sidewalks, under windows where someone, somewhere, can't bring themselves to close the day. Christmas Eve was one of those nights. Snow drifted past the glass facade of Whitmore Tower, catching the golden light spilling from the grand lobby. Inside, the building had been remade into a winter postcard. White fairy lights cascaded down marble pillars like frozen waterfalls. Garlands of pine and eucalyptus wrapped the balcony railings, threaded with tiny stars that blinked as if breathing. The air smelled of cinnamon, spiced wine, polished stone, and money. Henry Calder adjusted his grip on his daughter's hand as they stepped in from the cold. He always felt too loud in places like this, even when he didn't say a word. His work shirt, gray, clean, but permanently faded, seemed to announce what he was the moment anyone looked at him. The calluses on his fingers, the faint smears of grease in the creases of his knuckles, the worn knees of his slacks. Maintenance, night staff. The man people waved past with a distracted thanks while staring at their phones. But Audrey squeezed his hand, and everything in him softened. She was 7, all wiry energy and wide brown eyes, her dark curls escaping the neat braid he'd done that afternoon. Her cheap dress was pressed to perfection, a navy cotton thing with a crooked little bow he'd sewn back on himself. Over it she wore a puffy jacket that had seen too many winters, but she wore it like a cape. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes darting everywhere at once. "There's a chocolate fountain. Look, look!" He followed her pointing finger. Near a long table where desserts gleamed under soft lighting, a tower of glossy chocolate flowed in slow, rich curtains. Employees in suits and sequined dresses laughed nearby, their voices blending with the muted jazz playing from hidden speakers. "Can I have one of the strawberries?" Audrey asked, already bouncing. "In a bit," Henry said gently. "Let's just find a quiet spot first, okay? Remember, this is Daddy's work party, not a playground." She nodded solemnly, then broke into another grin, as if the seriousness could only hang on her for a few seconds before joy pushed it away again. They moved through the crowd almost unseen. People parted around them without really noticing they had done so, like water sliding around a stone. A few nodded to Henry, the security guard at the main doors, the older woman from accounting who always dropped her pen under her desk and apologized for making him get on his knees to retrieve it. But most barely registered him. They saw the uniform. They didn't see the man. Henry's fingers itched when he passed the piano. It stood in the far corner of the lobby, a vintage black Steinway, polished to a mirror shine. Most days it sat with a cover draped over its closed lid, used more as prop than instrument. Tonight, the cover had been removed. Someone had placed a crystal bowl of ornaments on top, as if even the piano needed to be dressed up to justify its existence. He let his eyes rest on it for a fraction of a second too long. Once, years ago, he'd stood on stages where instruments like that were the center of gravity in a room. Once, his name had run in small print on posters for regional concerts. Once, people had leaned forward when he sat down at a keyboard, hungry for what his hands could summon. Once, he blinked the memory away. "Daddy?" Audrey tugged at his arm. "You okay?" He smiled down at her. "I'm okay, Bug. Just thinking." "About pipes and vents?" she teased, because she knew that was what he fixed. "Always," he said. "You know me. I dream in broken thermostats." She giggled, and the sound loosened something in his chest that had been tight since he got the invitation to the party. Someone had decided to include the essential staff this year, which meant a handful of maintenance workers and janitors had been told they could bring one guest. Most of them had shrugged and declined. Henry had almost done the same, until Audrey saw the flyer he'd left on the kitchen table. "Daddy, it says Christmas party," she'd breathed, turning the paper gently as if it were delicate. "And you can bring a guest. I can be the guest, right? Please?" He'd hesitated. He thought about the way people looked at him when he pushed the cleaning cart down the executive hallways. He thought about her cheap dress and scuffed shoes. Then he thought about how she stared at the city lights from their small apartment window, as if trying to memorize a world she wasn't allowed to enter. "Yeah," he'd said softly. "You can be my guest." And so here they were. Across the lobby, on the mezzanine level, Ingrid Whitmore stood with a glass of champagne in her hand and a perfectly measured distance in her eyes. She rested one hand lightly on the brass railing, looking down at the sea of faces below as if surveying an empire. In a way, she was. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Whitmore Holdings history and the first woman to lead it. The company her father had nearly driven into the ground now owned a lion's share of the city's waterfront properties. Her signature was on deals worth more than some people would see in 10 lifetimes. She wore a crimson dress that fell in clean lines from her shoulders, the neckline sharp enough to be a statement but tasteful enough to silence gossip. Her honey blonde hair curled softly past her collarbone, every strand lying exactly where it should. Her makeup was perfect, her posture precise. Her smile, when it appeared, never quite made it all the way to her eyes. Those eyes, pale blue, clear and cold, were the first thing most people remembered about her. They had seen 1,000 presentations, 1,000 balance sheets, 1,000 faces trying to hide fear or greed or desperation. They had learned to weigh people in a glance. Tonight, they skimmed over the crowd, ticking through a familiar inventory. Key investors near the bar, the acquisitions team near the tree, her father's old golf buddies by the catering station, the board chairman shaking hands with the new general counsel. Everything in its place. Almost. Her gaze paused for a moment on the small girl near the dessert table reaching for a strawberry, her dark curls bouncing. The man beside the girl, tall in a gray work shirt, knelt, saying something that made the child giggle. Ingrid didn't know his name. She knew roughly how many janitors were on staff, how many maintenance workers worked third shift. She knew the budget line item that contained their salaries. She knew, intellectually, that without them the building would grind to a halt. But she did not know their individual histories, their favorite songs, their children's names. She had taught herself not to know those things. It made decisions easier. Still, there was something about the way the man looked at the girl, how every line in his body softened around her, that caught at her. A flicker of warmth rose, threatened to crack the ice, and she tamped it down with practiced ease. "Thinking about the year's numbers?" a smooth voice asked at her elbow. She turned slightly. Flynn Baker stood beside her, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that looked like it had been poured onto him. His chestnut hair was styled with careful precision, his cufflinks catching the light. His smile was camera-ready. "My favorite topic," she said dryly. He chuckled, looping his arm through hers as if it already belonged to him. "Well, in that case, you'll be delighted to know that the final projections for the merger are even better than we thought. Once the wedding is done, the joint announcement is going to send shockwaves through the market." Behind his words, she heard what he really meant. Once you are officially tied to my firm. Once your name and my portfolio become one entity. Once your personal choices are fully aligned with my financial interests. Her fingers tightened on the railing for a moment. 6 weeks. That was the timeline. 6 weeks until the wedding her father had orchestrated like another acquisition. 6 weeks until she walked down an aisle toward a man who talked about love like it was a bullet point under long-term strategic synergy. She had agreed because it seemed easier than fighting. Because she had learned that when she pushed back too hard, her father questioned not just her judgment, but her right to lead. because she admitted in the quiet rooms of her own mind, some part of her had stopped believing she deserved anything gentler than a calculated partnership. "I'll toast to it," she said, lifting her glass. Flynn's smile sharpened. "That's my girl." She almost flinched at the phrase. Below, the string of events that would unravel her carefully managed life began with something small and ordinary, a spilled drink. Audrey had made it as far as the dessert table. The strawberries glistened under the lights, each one half dipped in chocolate. She stretched on her toes, fingers splayed, reaching for one that sat just beyond her reach. Her foot slid. The drop of champagne on the marble was invisible until it wasn't. Her heel hit the slick spot, and her little body flew forward. Her knee slammed into the floor with a sound that made Henry's heart lurch across the room. He was beside her before her mind caught up with the pain. Hey, I've got you," he murmured, dropping to his knees. Her face had crumpled, tears spilling over, one hand clutching his sleeve. Blood blossomed in a dark stain on her white tights. He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, a habit born of a childhood where scrapes and bruises were constant and no one had bandages, and pressed it gently to her knee. "It hurts," she sobbed. "I know," he said quietly. "I know, Bug. Breathe for me. In, out. You're okay." His voice fell into a rhythm he'd used for years, the same cadence that had soothed her nightmares when she woke crying for a mother she'd never remember. Audrey's sobs slowed to hiccups. She leaned into him, small fingers digging into the fabric at his shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered, "I got blood on the floor. I'm sorry." "That's what I'm here for," he said, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "I clean floors for a living, remember?" He slid his arm under her legs, ready to lift her. "Let's find a restroom and wash this properly. We'll get you a bandage. Then maybe that strawberry as a medical treatment, yeah?" Before he could stand, another voice sliced into the fragile quiet. "Is there a reason your child is bleeding on my lobby floor?" Henry looked up. Flynn stood over them, hand in his pocket, irritation tightening his jaw. Up close, the smoothness of his appearance looked more like a mask. His eyes, clear hazel, sharp and assessing, did a quick scan. Child, blood, uniform, cheap shoes. His verdict hit Henry like a slap. "This is a corporate event," Flynn said, gesturing at the room as if Henry couldn't see it. "Not a daycare. Can you control your child or not?" Audrey flinched at the tone, shrinking into Henry's chest. He felt her shoulders tremble. "Sir," Henry said evenly, "she slipped on a spill. It was an accident. An accident that wouldn't have happened if you understood boundaries." Flynn's gaze slid deliberately over Henry's clothes. "Your maintenance. There is a staff entrance for a reason. Bringing your kid here like this, letting her run around. What did you think this was? Some kind of field trip?" Henry's jaw clenched. He swallowed the first answer that rose to his tongue. Years of being at the bottom of hierarchies had taught him how to pick his battles. "She's 7, he said softly. "She was reaching for dessert. That's all. I'll clean the floor. I'll get her out of the way." "You should have left her at home," Flynn said. "If you can't afford childcare, maybe you should reconsider breeding." Henry's vision narrowed, white edging in at the corners. He felt Audrey stiffen at the word. He felt heat flood his chest. He opened his mouth. Someone beat him to it. "That's enough." The voice was quiet. It silenced the room. Ingrid descended the mezzanine steps with the same measured control she used walking into a board meeting. Each click of her heel on the marble floor was steady, precise, deliberate. Conversations faded. People turned, sensing a change in the air before they saw her. She stopped a few feet away. Her eyes, that cold winter blue, locked on Flynn first. "You do not speak to my employees that way," she said. There was no raise in volume, but the clarity of her tone cut cleaner than a shout. "Not in my building. Not at my event. Not ever." Flynn stiffened. "Ingrid, I was... apologize," she said. "To him. To his daughter." He stared at her, taken aback. "I was only... apologize," she repeated, the word falling like a gavel. The silence deepened. People who had been pretending not to watch gave up the pretense altogether. Flynn's jaw worked. The mask slipped for a heartbeat, and Henry saw the resentment underneath. Then Flynn's lips peeled back into something that was technically a smile. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes not quite meeting Henry's. He dipped his head toward Audrey like a man bowing under duress. "I overreacted." Henry said nothing. He didn't trust his voice not to splinter. Ingrid turned to him then. Up close, her beauty was almost disorienting, not because of symmetry or perfection, but because her face flickered between armor and something almost fragile. He saw the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the tightness at the edges of her mouth. He saw a woman who slept less than she claimed and worried more than she admitted. He also saw the way her gaze lingered on Audrey, softening by a degree that might have been invisible to anyone who didn't spend their life reading tiny shifts in people's moods. "Is she hurt badly?" she asked. "Just a scrape," Henry said. "It looks worse than it is." "Kids bleed like... fountains." "Fountains are for chocolate tonight," Audrey muttered, hiccuping, and Henry huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. Ingrid's mouth twitched. "The first aid kit is in the executive lounge on the 5th floor," she said. "Take the brass elevator behind the reception desk. I'll tell security to let you up. It's quieter there, easier to breathe." There was something in the way she said that last sentence that made Henry look up at her more closely. For a moment, they simply regarded each other. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, stepped aside, and the crowd parted for him as if she had commanded the sea. By the time Henry came back down with Audrey, her knee cleaned and bandaged, her spirits buoyed by a mug of hot chocolate and a fistful of cookies, the executive assistant insisted she take. The party had grown louder. Someone had shifted the music from soft jazz to holiday classics. People were tipsier, looser. The piano sat open now, glossy keys exposed. A junior accountant plunked out a clumsy version of Jingle Bells while his friends cheered him on. He knew 3 chords and used all of them, repeatedly, with reckless enthusiasm. Audrey stopped dead when she saw the instrument. "Daddy," she said. He knew that tone, the one that held both awe and certainty, as if she'd just spotted a door to Narnia and assumed he had the key. "No," he said automatically. "Please," she whispered. "Just one song. You promised you'd play for me on Christmas Eve." He had. In their kitchen, days ago, when she'd asked if Santa liked music and he'd said, "If he does, we'll make sure he hears some." He looked at the piano. The old tremor in his right hand seemed to wake, alive and vicious, under his skin. It wasn't the injury itself that terrified him anymore. It was what it represented. The memory of metal and screams and the sickening crunch as his hand was pinned under falling rigging. The year that followed, surgery after surgery, pain that swallowed entire days, a doctor explaining in carefully neutral tones that yes, he'd be able to use the hand, but no, not like before. For a long time afterward, he hadn't been able to touch a keyboard without feeling nauseous, as if the instrument had turned from friend to witness, a silent thing that watched and remembered his failure. "Daddy," Audrey said again, softer this time. It helps me sleep when you play." He looked at her bandaged knee, at the smudge of dried tears on her cheek, at the little galaxy of chocolate dots on her sleeve from where she'd missed her mouth. She was trying to look brave, but her eyes carried the echo of Flynn's cruelty like a shadow. "It's Christmas Eve," Henry thought. "How many more years will she ask me like this?" He exhaled. "Okay," he said. "Just one song." The accountant slid off the bench gladly when Henry approached. A small hush rippled through the immediate circle. People always quieted, instinctively, when someone sat at a piano with the intention to play more than a joke. Henry ran his fingertips lightly over the keys, barely pressing them. The instrument hummed under his touch, waiting. Someone dimmed the lobby lights a fraction. The fairy lights and the tree glowed warmly. Snow brushed against the windows like someone breathing on glass from the other side. Ingrid was midway through a conversation with an investor when the first notes reached her. They floated up the open atrium like something alive, threading through the murmur of voices, slipping under the clink of glassware, cutting through the dull roar of party noise. She stopped mid-sentence. The investor followed her gaze. "Everything all right, Ms. Whitmore?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Sound and time had collided and ripped her backward. The melody was gentle at first, so soft it seemed afraid to exist. Notes fell like snow, each one placed with painstaking care, as if the player were laying down stepping stones across a frozen river. She knew them. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass. No, not just knew. Her body knew them. Her skin, her marrow, the part of her that remembered nights in a way no calendar ever could. 16 years peeled away in an instant. The lobby blurred. The tower, the investors, the pressed suits, all of it flickered. She was 18 again, lying on her back in the damp grass of a summer camp hillside, staring up at a sky so full of stars it made her eyes ache. Leon Merritt sat at the old upright piano in the camp's rec hall, the windows thrown open to let in the warm air. His wild, dark hair fell into his eyes as he played. He'd laughed when she asked him what the song was. "It's yours," he'd said. "I wrote it for you." He'd called it Starlit Promise because she'd once told him she wished she could pluck a star from the sky and put it in a jar, just to prove that some things really could be kept. 3 weeks later, he was gone. A rain-slick highway, a late-night drive, a car that never made it past the guardrail. She had told herself she'd imagined the song's perfection. Grief did that, she'd learned. Turned simple things into sacred relics. The melody had become a ghost in her head, something that rose unbidden when she couldn't sleep. She'd never heard it again. Until now. Her heart pounded, each beat slamming against her ribs. She set her glass down blindly on the nearest table and moved to the railing, gripping it so hard her fingers hurt. The man at the piano, maintenance uniform, sleeves rolled up, left hand marked by pale scars that disappeared under his cuff, had his eyes closed as he played. His right hand trembled slightly when it lifted between phrases, but the tremor vanished on contact with the keys. The music swelled. What had begun as a whisper grew into something fierce and aching. The song wrapped itself around the room, around her. Every phrase was familiar. Every pause fell exactly where it had all those years ago. The melody rose toward its peak, hovered on the knife edge of a suspended chord, then resolved into a tender, yearning line that felt like a question answered and a promise broken all at once. It was impossible. Leon had died before anyone else could have heard the full piece. He'd been possessive of it in that last week, telling her she was the only one it was for, the only one who would ever truly hear it. So how? Her breath came in shallow pulls. The lobby tilted, then righted itself. She forced her body to move. She descended the stairs like a sleepwalker, the song pulling her along as inexorably as gravity. When she reached the bottom, the crowd parted without knowing why, leaving her standing 3 feet from the piano as the last notes faded into the air. The man opened his eyes. For a moment they simply stared at each other. His gaze, gray-green, steady despite the storm she could see closing in behind it, met hers and held. He looked startled but not surprised, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times and still couldn't quite believe it was real. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was raw, scraped thin. He rose slowly from the bench. Audrey stood nearby, her small hand resting on the piano's side, watching the adults with the serious, careful attention children used when they sensed the ground shifting under their feet. "It's just an old melody," he said. "Something I picked up a long time ago." "Don't lie to me." The words came out sharper than she intended. The room seemed to shrink around them. Laughter and chatter continued at the edges, but here, in the small circle where their lives had collided, there was only the echo of the song and the ragged sound of her breathing. "That piece," she said, moving closer, "was written for me 16 years ago, by someone who died 3 weeks later. No one else knew it. No one else could have known it. Every note, every space between notes, exactly the same." "How can you play it?" He swallowed. She saw his throat move. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. That was not the answer she'd expected. Not denial, not confusion. An apology for existing inside a memory that followed her like a shadow. She took another step forward. "Who are you?" Before he could answer, a small hand closed around his fingers. "Daddy," Audrey said, rubbing her eyes. "Can we go home now? I'm really tired." "Daddy." The word slipped into Ingrid's chest and lodged there. She looked from the child to the man. He shifted automatically, angling his body to place himself between her and the little girl, not aggressively, but protectively, as if he'd had practice shielding this child from the worst of the world. Something inside Ingrid softened in spite of herself. This was her lobby, her company, her night. She could demand answers, strip him down to data and timelines and facts until the inexplicable had a ledger. She could order HR to pull his entire history, call security, interrogate him until she understood. But the child's eyes were drooping. The adrenaline that had carried Ingrid off the mezzanine was fading, leaving behind the dull, familiar ache of grief and the new, sharper edge of confusion. She released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Take your daughter home," she said. "She's had enough excitement for one night." He hesitated, as if unsure whether this was dismissal, mercy, or both. She stepped back, giving them space. He nodded once, a small, grateful movement, and guided Audrey toward the exit. The doors opened, letting in a brief gust of cold air and the smell of snow. Then they were gone. The party regained its volume around her, as if someone had slowly turned up a dial. A few people glanced her way, curiosity flickering across their faces, but no one approached. They knew her well enough to recognize that tonight they did not want to be on the receiving end of those eyes. Ingrid stood beside the piano for a long moment, staring at the keys as if they might rearrange themselves into an answer. They didn't. She didn't sleep that night. In her apartment high above the city, a glass and steel nest with a view that made visitors gasp, she lay awake in the dark, listening to the hum of the heating system and the distant wail of a siren several blocks away. Every time she closed her eyes, the past surged up, Leon's laugh, loud and pure. The way his fingers flew across worn keys in the camp hall, transforming the cheap instrument into something transcendent. The look on his face the night he played her Starlit Promise for the first time, equal parts pride and vulnerability. "If I mess it up," he'd joked, "you have to still pretend to love me." She had shoved his shoulder, pretending not to hear the seriousness under the joke. Then the other image. The man in her lobby. Eyes closed, scars catching the light on his hand, coaxing the same melody into existence as if he'd written it in his sleep. Her mind tried to stitch together a rational explanation. Coincidence. A similar progression. A trick of memory. Perhaps she had filled in the gaps without realizing. Her heart knew better. By morning, her grief had calcified back into something cold and manageable. But a new emotion had taken root alongside it. Fury. Fury that the past could reach out and grab her by the throat after all this time. Fury that someone had taken something sacred and used it without asking. Fury that the one thing she'd believed was hers alone had turned out not to be. She arrived at the office 2 hours early. The building felt hollow at that hour. The holiday decorations glowed in a softer, lonelier way. She went straight to HR and requested the file. Henry Calder, maintenance. It wasn't thick. No college degree. Employment history full of short-term, low-wage jobs, warehouse, grocery store stocker, night shift supervisor at a storage facility, hired at Whitmore Holdings 3 years ago, no listed spouse, emergency contact, Audrey Calder, daughter. Ingrid stared at the line that reduced a life to bullet points and dates. She turned the pages, searching for some mention of music. There was nothing. No note about a gap in employment. No explanation for the faint medical notation that showed he'd been on disability for nearly a year, a decade earlier. The file offered facts. None of them answered the only question that mattered. On her desk, an old business card lay half buried under a stack of documents. She slid it out. Corbin Hale. Composer. Educator. Berkshire Music Academy. She had not seen him since Leon's funeral. He had given the eulogy with a voice that shook only once when he said, "He loved the piano like most people love other people." Her thumb hovered over her phone for a moment, then she dialed. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" "Corbin," she said. "It's Ingrid Whitmore." A pause, then a warm, surprised chuckle. "Ingrid, my God." "It's been a lifetime." "Feels like it," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her. "I need to ask you something. About a song." He came that evening. Time had silvered his dark hair and etched deeper lines around his eyes, but the essential kindness in his face remained. He sat across from her in her office, the city sprawled out in lights behind him, and listened as she explained. When she played him the phone recording, grainy audio taken by some employee last night who'd felt compelled to capture the stranger's performance, he closed his eyes, just as Henry had done when he played. After a few measures, Corbin's shoulders dropped. He removed his glasses and pressed his thumb and forefinger into the bridge of his nose. "Well," he said softly when it ended, "I never thought I'd hear that again." "It's the same?" Ingrid asked. "Starlit Promise?" "It's complicated," he said. She froze. "What do you mean, complicated?" Corbin leaned back, the chair creaking under his slight weight. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could bear. 16 years ago, he said. Leon came to me halfway through camp and played me 8 bars of a melody. The opening of what became that song. It was beautiful, even then, but incomplete. He was stuck. You know how he was. Brilliant but dramatic. If something didn't reveal itself quickly, he convinced himself it was ruined. He kept throwing out versions and starting again. "I remember," Ingrid said. He used to get angry at the piano like it had betrayed him. Corbin smiled faintly. Exactly. There was another student in the composition program that summer. Quiet. Came in on a need-based scholarship. He didn't have Leon's shine. People didn't flock to him. But he had an ear. One afternoon, I heard him working through a continuation of those first 8 bars, and it was astonishing. He'd taken Leon's idea and carried it somewhere the boy himself wouldn't have gone. Her heart beat faster. Are you saying that the version you know, Corbin said gently, the one Leon played for you, was a collaboration? Leon started it. The other student finished it. But then the accident happened, and the song became part of the mythology of a life cut short. Why didn't anyone tell me? She whispered. Because you were 18, Corbin said, and shattered. Because your parents wanted a clean narrative for the speeches and the scholarship fund. It was easier to say, this is Leon's song. The other student never asked for credit. He left camp quietly and, frankly, the world moved on. I told myself letting you believe the simpler story was an act of mercy. He winced. I may have been wrong. Who was he? Ingrid asked. The question came out almost as a plea. The other student. Corbin frowned, riffling through the filing cabinet of his memory. His name. I remember his face. His hands. He had a scar along one knuckle, from a kitchen job. He was always tired. I want to say Henry, but... He shook his head. It was a long time ago. I'd have to go back through the old records to be sure. Could it have been... She turned her laptop around, showing him the paused frame of the video. Henry at the piano, head bowed, lobby lights shining on his worn shirt. Corbin squinted. He looks older, but maybe. I can't say for certain, but whoever he is, he plays like someone who's lived with that melody for a very long time. There's only one way to know, Ingrid said. I'll ask him. Except when she tried, he was gone. He didn't show up for his next shift, or the one after that. HR hadn't received a formal resignation. He had simply vanished. When she sent security to the address on file, the landlord shrugged. They left 3 days ago, he said. Little girl and the dad. Gave notice, paid up, packed light. No forwarding address. Ingrid stared at the peeling paint in the narrow hallway, feeling something close to panic clutch at her throat. She had spent her adult life building systems that made people trackable, through accounts, contracts, obligations. It felt obscene that he could simply disappear. Did he say why? She asked. Just that he had to go, the landlord said. Seemed like a decent guy. Fixed my boiler for free when I was in a jam. Didn't tell me much else. She returned to the tower with snow clinging to her coat, and a growing sense that her world, which she'd always believed to be firmly anchored to reality, had shifted into a space where music and ghosts rewrote the rules. Days passed. The building felt wrong without him in it. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd become to the quiet presence of the night staff, the faint rattle of carts down the hall, the whir of vacuums behind closed doors. Now every shadow seemed to hold an absence shaped like a man at a piano. She threw herself into work. Meetings, calls, merger negotiations. Her father grew more agitated with each small delay in the wedding planning. Flynn hovered, all charm and veiled threats, talking about shareholder confidence and the optics of personal stability. None of it could drown out the melody that looped in her head. Snow was falling again the night he came back. It was late, The lobby lights were dimmed to their overnight setting, the holiday decorations now slightly askew from weeks of existence. Ingrid left a meeting with the legal team, eyes burning from staring at documents all day, and headed for the elevators. Then she heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. She stopped. Music drifted up from the lobby. Not the bland piano covers the building sometimes piped through its speaker system, but real live notes. The first phrases of Starlit Promise played with a hesitancy that suggested the hands on the keys were as afraid as they were compelled. Without thinking, she turned and took the stairs. He sat at the piano with his back to her, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of what he was doing pressed down on him. "You came back," she said. Her voice echoed more than she meant it to in the empty space. His hands stilled. His shoulders rose and fell once. "I shouldn't have run," he said, not turning. "Audrey kept asking why we left so fast. I didn't have a good answer. Just fear. And that's not something I want her to learn from me." He turned then. Up close, without the chaos of a party between them, she could see the details the dim light had hidden before. The silver threads beginning in his light brown hair, the faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the tiredness, deeper than just lack of sleep, that lived in his eyes. "I owe you the truth," he said. "Even if it hurts." She moved closer until she could rest her hand lightly on the edge of the piano. "Then start with this," she said. "That song, Starlit Promise. Did you write it?" He didn't flinch. "Yes," he said. Ingrid's knees threatened to buckle. She gripped the piano to steady herself, the cool wood grounding her. "But Leon—" "Started it," Henry said gently. "He brought the first 8 bars to camp. They were beautiful. But he was stuck. Corbin encouraged him to ask for help. I was the quiet kid in the corner with a scholarship and a lot of ideas and no confidence. I took his beginning and finished it. Wrote through the night, actually. Nearly missed breakfast the next morning." "I remember that," she whispered. "He showed up with ink on his sleeve and a stupid, huge grin. He told me he'd solved it. He said he'd been inspired." "He was," Henry said. "By you." "So you wrote a love song for me," she said, the realization tasting strange on her tongue. "And let someone else give it to me as if it were his?" "I wrote a love song for you," he corrected softly, and asked him to deliver it. She just stared at him. "Why?" she managed finally. The corner of his mouth lifted in a self-deprecating half-smile. "Have you looked in a mirror, Ingrid? Back then you were... you. Even at 18. You walked into a room and people reorganized themselves around you. Leon was brilliant and loud and sure of himself. I was a kid from a nowhere town who worked nights washing dishes to afford bus fare to camp. I barely believed I deserved to touch that piano, much less hand someone like you a piece of my heart." Her throat tightened. "Leon offered to tell you," Henry continued. "He wasn't a thief. He said we should share the credit. But I told him no. I told him the song was better in your memory if it was simple. One boy, one melody, one promise. You were always meant to remember him as the star, not the quiet kid watching from the corner." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "And then he died," she said. "And then he died," Henry echoed. "And at the funeral, they played the song. They called it his. It became part of the tragedy. I thought about standing up and saying something. Actually, half of that came from someone you've already forgotten. But what would that have done except make a mess of your grief? So I kept my mouth shut. It felt kinder and weaker. Both." She looked at his right hand then. The scars were more visible in this light, pale ridges and whorls that twisted across his palm and up his wrist. "What happened?" she asked. "To your hand?" He looked down at it as if he'd almost forgotten it was still attached to him. 3 years after camp, he said. I signed a contract with a performance company. It felt like a miracle. I was 21. My parents cried when I told them I could pay my own way. I thought the rest of my life had finally arrived. He huffed a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. It was Whitmore Productions, he said. The room seemed to tilt again. My father's old division, Ingrid said slowly. Yeah, Henry said. We were doing a touring show. I was in rehearsal one night when a lighting rig came loose. There was a cellist standing underneath it, completely oblivious. I pushed him out of the way. The rig came down on my hand. By the time they dragged me free, most of the bones were broken. He spoke calmly, but Ingrid heard the echo of the younger man in his words, the disbelief, the outrage, the terror of watching everything he'd built shatter in an instant. The insurance investigation, Henry went on, found that the equipment had been repaired with cheaper parts to save money. Your father signed the approvals. The company settled. I got enough to cover surgeries and rehab. After that, the contract was terminated. I was no longer a good investment. Her stomach twisted. I never knew, she whispered. I believe you, he said. You were in business school by then. He kept a lot of things off your radar. There were other people hurt. A stagehand, a rigger. We all got some hush money and a reminder that in the math of profit, some lives are rounding errors. Did you sue? She asked. I tried, he said. My lawyer quit after 2 months. Said I didn't have enough leverage, that the company would bury me in paperwork. I ran out of money. Eventually, I stopped trying. He flexed his hand, the scars catching the lobby's dim light. I can still play, he said. Sort of. Not like before, not with the same speed or endurance. The pain comes and goes, but the audition calls stopped. The scholarship offers evaporated. The world has a short memory for damaged goods. So you... She looked at the uniform, the work boots, the way he moved through her building without anyone really seeing him. You started fixing things instead of playing. He shrugged. When you've watched something expensive collapse because someone cut a corner, you get very serious about bolts and brackets. It felt honest. If I couldn't make music, at least I could make sure nothing else fell on anyone's head. Silence stretched between them. I didn't come here to haunt you, he said finally. When I took this job, I didn't realize whose name was on the building. I just needed steady work, health insurance, a schedule that let me pick up my daughter from school. And when you realized? She asked. I thought about quitting, he admitted. But the pay was better than most. The benefits kept my kid in checkups and vaccinations. And seeing you from a distance. His cheeks colored. It was like proof that the past had actually happened, that I hadn't imagined you. Or the music. That's why you left, she said softly. After the party. He nodded. You looked at me like I'd stolen something from you, he said. And maybe I did. Or maybe I gave you back a truth I should have shared sooner. Either way, I panicked. I didn't want Audrey caught in my mess. So I ran. Like a coward. He looked at her, eyes steady. I came back because she asked me why, he said. She wanted to know why we stopped seeing the big Christmas tree. Why the lady with the nice shoes who helped us find the bandages looked so sad. I didn't have an answer that sounded like something I'd want her to believe. So, here I am. Before Ingrid could speak, another voice cut across the lobby. I knew I'd find you here. Flynn's footsteps echoed as he came through the doors, followed by 2 men in dark suits, and behind them, moving with the slow, inevitable confidence of someone who had never needed to rush for anything, her father. George Whitmore was in his 60s now, his once black hair gone silver at the temples. His suit was charcoal, his tie perfectly knotted. Time had deepened the lines in his face but not softened them. His eyes, cold and assessing, slid from his daughter to Henry and narrowed. "So it's true," he said. "My daughter is slumming it with the janitorial staff." "George," Ingrid began. "Don't," he said sharply. "You have no idea what this looks like from the outside. Flynn calls me in a panic, says you're jeopardizing the merger, the company, our legacy over some sad story from a nobody." Ingrid's gaze snapped to Flynn. The satisfaction in his eyes was barely hidden. "You called him?" she asked. He spread his hands. "I was concerned. I'm your fiancé. I thought your father should know you're being manipulated." Henry's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask her for anything," he said quietly. "Of course you didn't," George said, voice dripping with contempt. "Men like you never need to ask. You just parade your broken pieces around and wait for someone with a conscience to trip over them. Then you sue." Ingrid stepped closer to her father, rage rising like heat under her skin. "That accident," she said, "at Whitmore Productions, the one you never told me details about. He was there. He saved someone's life. Your company's negligence destroyed his career." George's lip curled. "He was a clumsy kid who wandered where he wasn't supposed to be. We paid him. We owe him nothing." "You cut corners on safety to save money," Ingrid said. "You signed off on faulty equipment." "It's called business," George snapped. "Sacrifices have to be made. If he'd been truly exceptional, he would have found a way to rise above it. But look at him." He gestured at Henry's uniform. "He's exactly where he was always meant to be." Ingrid's hands shook. "You don't get to decide that," she said. "You don't get to break people and then call it destiny." Flynn stepped in, smelling like expensive cologne and smug certainty. "Let's be practical," he said. "Ingrid, the press already circles you like vultures. If they catch wind of this, of you involved with an employee who has a prior claim against your company, do you have any idea what they'll do with it? CEO in bed with litigious ex-performer, gold-digging janitor and the heiress. Investors will panic." "Our merger, your merger," she cut in. "Your firm, your portfolio, your access." He blinked, as if she'd spoken in another language. "My firm is your firm once we're married," he said. "That's the point." "Is it?" she asked. "Because I thought the point of marriage was something else." George snorted. "Don't be naive. You gave up fairy tales the day you stepped into this office." "That's the thing, Dad," she said quietly. "I didn't give them up. You took them, piece by piece. Every time I liked someone who wasn't strategically beneficial, every time I wanted something soft, you taught me softness was weakness." She turned back to Henry. For the first time, the weight of their watching eyes, the accusation in her father's, the calculation in Flynn's, the uncertainty in Henry's, didn't make her shrink inward. It made her straighten. "I'm done trading my humanity for your approval," she said. "To hell with this," George snapped. "Enough. You will end this little melodrama. You will stop seeing this man. You will set a date for the wedding and stop embarrassing our name." "No," she said. The word landed between them like a dropped glass. George stared. "What did you say?" "No," she repeated. "I won't marry someone I don't love. I won't pretend this man is nothing when he saved a life. When he wrote the only piece of music that got me through losing Leon. When he nearly died because you decided safety wasn't profitable." Flynn's expression darkened. The polished charm peeled away. "You're making a mistake," he said. I have documents that could make your board very nervous about some of your more aggressive acquisitions. I was going to keep them under wraps once we were married. Alone, you're vulnerable. With me, you're protected. Blackmail isn't protection, she said. It's a leash. You'll regret this, he hissed. Maybe, she said, but I'll regret marrying you every single day of my life. I'll have my lawyers send you something in the morning. We're done, Flynn. She nodded to security, who had drifted closer when voices rose. Please escort Mr. Baker out of the building. He doesn't work here, and he's no longer a guest. They hesitated, glancing at George. Ingrid lifted her chin. That's an instruction from your CEO, she said. Not a suggestion. They moved. Flynn blustered, threatened lawsuits, vowed revenge. But eventually the doors closed behind him. The lobby felt larger without his presence. George looked at his daughter as if she were a stranger. You throw away everything for what? He demanded. A man who cleans your floors? A has-been who gave up when life got hard? He didn't give up, she said. He adapted. He raised a child alone. He worked himself to the bone. He kept playing even when it hurt. That's more strength than any of your boardroom bullies will ever show. George sneered. He will drag you down. You think investors will line up to be associated with this little sob story? Maybe some will walk, she said. But others might remember that companies are made of human beings, not just numbers, and those are the people I want. He shook his head, disgusted. You're sentimental, he said. I should never have handed you this company. You didn't, she said quietly. I took it. I made it profitable. I modernized it. I kept it out of court more times than you know because I refused to cut the corners you did. If the board wants to punish me for finally living according to the same ethics I've enforced on them, we'll see how that goes. His glare lingered on Henry, then returned to her. You're no longer my daughter, he said. The words should have hurt more than they did, but somehow, in this moment, they felt like the naming of a reality that had existed, unspoken, for years. No, she said. I stopped being your daughter the day you decided profit mattered more than people. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. He left without another word. The echo of his departure slowly faded. The lobby lights hummed. Snow brushed the glass. Somewhere upstairs, a cleaning crew vacuumed an empty conference room. Ingrid realized she was shaking. Henry moved first. He didn't say, I'm sorry, or you didn't have to do that. He didn't offer to disappear to make things easier. He stepped closer, gently, as if approaching a startled animal. Are you okay? He asked. It was the simplest of questions. The kind nobody asked her anymore because they assumed the answer or didn't care. No, she said honestly. But I will be. A small, sleepy voice piped up from the lobby chairs a few feet away. Daddy? They both turned. Audrey pushed herself upright, rubbing her eyes. Henry had laid his jacket over her earlier when she'd fallen asleep waiting for him. It slid down her shoulders as she stood and shuffled over. Why is everyone yelling? She asked. Is it because I spilled the juice the other day? I said I was sorry. Henry knelt, pulling her into his arms. It's not about you, Bug, he murmured into her curls. Grown-ups are just messy. She looked over his shoulder at Ingrid. Are you sad? Audrey asked her. A little, Ingrid said. The understatement tasted bitter and true. But sad isn't always bad. Sometimes it means you did something scary and right at the same time. Daddy's brave, Audrey announced, with the unshakable conviction of a child. He plays even when his hand hurts. He didn't stop. Ingrid's gaze met Henry's over the girl's head. Yes, she said softly.
He is.
The piano sat beside them, its keys still and expectant.
Will you play it again?
She asked, surprising herself.
The song. For me. For...
She glanced at Audrey.
For all of us.
Henry hesitated, then shifted so Audrey could sit beside him on the bench. Her legs dangled, swinging. She placed her small fingers on the white keys where he showed her. "This part's yours," he told her quietly. "Just these two notes. Back and forth, like breathing." She nodded, tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. He began. The melody unfurled once more into the lobby, but it had changed. Not in notes, the structure was the same, but in weight. The grief was still there, but now it braided with something new. Release. The knowledge that what had been hidden was finally spoken, that what had been stolen was, in some small way, given back. Audrey's hesitant notes threaded through his, wobbling, imperfect, earnest. It made the whole thing more beautiful. Ingrid stood close enough to feel the air move under his hands. She placed her palm on the polished wood of the piano, feeling it vibrate. When the last chord faded, hanging in the air like a held breath finally exhaled, she reached for his damaged hand. He let her take it. His skin was warm. The scars felt like a map under her fingers, of every place he'd broken and healed crooked.
"I need to ask you something," she said.
He looked at her, eyes wary but open.
"If I asked you to let me know you," she said slowly, "really know you, not just the shadows of who you were in someone else's story. If I asked you to stay, even though my life is complicated, even though people will talk, even though my father will fight, even though the press will be cruel, would you be brave enough to say yes?" He stared at her, and she saw the fear flicker across his face. Fear of hope, of disappointment, of becoming someone's cautionary tale again. Then he smiled.
"I wrote you a love song 16 years ago," he said. "I think I can manage a little courage now." Her laugh broke on a sob.
"That's good,"
she said, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her free hand.
"Because I'm terrified, and I don't want to be alone in that."
"You're not," he said. The months that followed were not tidy. Flynn kept his promise. Leaked documents surfaced, half-truths wrapped in sensational headlines. CEO under fire for reckless deals and romantic entanglements. Photos of Ingrid leaving the building beside Henry, of Audrey holding both their hands, were splashed across tabloids like evidence of a crime. The board convened emergency meetings, but the story did not go the way Flynn expected. Corbin stepped forward publicly. He gave an interview in which he laid out the truth of Starlit Promise, the collaboration, the young student who had completed it, the accident that stole his career. A video of Henry playing in the lobby, Audrey beside him, Ingrid's hand resting gently on his shoulder, went viral. Comment sections filled with words like second chances and accountability and real love. For every investor who called for Ingrid's removal, 2 more expressed support, citing not only the company's strong performance, but the way she handled the scandal, with transparency, contrition for the past harm, and a commitment to change. She opened an internal review into old safety violations. She established clearer protocols. She insisted on a fund to support any employee injured on the job beyond legal minimums. George fought the board, furious at what he called her public self-flagellation. In the end, they forced him into retirement, offering a generous severance and a non-compete clause that removed his teeth from the company's future. He moved to Florida. The occasional bitter quote of his appeared in gossip columns, but he became, slowly, another voice shouting from the sidelines. Henry did not return to full-time maintenance. Ingrid offered him something else. Teach she said one evening as they sat on the floor of her living room, their backs against the couch, Audrey asleep in the next room. Not here, exactly. At the community center you used to practice in. I'll fund a music program, lessons for kids who can't afford them, instruments, a scholarship in Leon's name, and yours. Credit where it's due. He shook his head, overwhelmed.
You don't have to. I know, she said. I want to. For you. For him. For the kids who think their lives end where their neighborhood does. He looked at her, eyes shining. All right, he said. The first time he walked into the small, echoing room at the community center with a key in his hand and a group of nervous kids waiting, something inside him loosened. Teaching required a different kind of courage than performance. It demanded patience, humility, the willingness to sit with imperfection. He discovered he loved it. Audrey attended his classes twice a week, though she insisted on being treated like a normal student, not the teacher's daughter. Her laughter filled the room whenever someone hit the wrong note and turned it into something funny instead of a failure. A year after that first Christmas Eve, Whitmore Holdings hosted a holiday concert not in the lobby, but in a rented hall downtown. The stage was lined with children from the program, hands trembling over keys and strings and valves. Henry walked onto the stage in a simple black suit. It was not the concert hall he'd once imagined, but it felt more honest than any dream he'd had at 21. Ingrid watched from the wings, her heart lodged somewhere between her throat and her ribs. She wore red again, but not as armor. This time it was celebration, a color that said, I am here, fully, unapologetically. He sat at the grand piano. Audrey climbed onto a smaller bench beside him, feet not touching the ground. They played Starlit Promise. When they reached the ending, Henry didn't stop where the original version did. He lifted his hands, breathed, and let them fall into a new coda, notes that rose and turned and settled into something warm and steady. It was still the same song, but now it opened toward the future instead of circling a wound in the past. The applause when they finished crashed over them like a wave. Backstage, Ingrid pressed her forehead against his. The melody you wrote, she whispered, saved me twice. Once when I lost Leon, and again when it led me to you. Then every note was worth it, he said. Life after that wasn't a fairy tale. Bills still had to be paid. Audrey still scraped her knees and cried about math homework, and woke from nightmares sometimes. The press moved on to other scandals. Construction delays, protests, market crashes. The world remained what it had always been, beautiful and brutal, often in the same breath. But there were small, quiet moments that stitched themselves into a different kind of promise. A spring afternoon in the park, cherry blossoms falling like slow snow while Audrey chased butterflies. Ingrid's head resting on Henry's shoulder as he said, Maybe songs don't really end. Maybe they just move into their next movement. Then make me a promise, she said. Not forever. That's too big. Just today. Promise me you'll keep playing. For yourself, for Audrey, for us. Even when it hurts. I promise, he said. And meant it. A young pianist near the fountain, playing with all the earnest clumsiness of someone who didn't yet know the weight of their own longing. Henry stopping to listen, clapping when the boy finished, saying, Keep going, even when they tell you you're not enough. Especially then. That night in Ingrid's apartment when she slid onto the bench beside him and whispered, Play me something new. Just ours. He did. The melody started simple. 2 notes, back and forth, like a conversation in a quiet room. It grew, stumbled, found its footing, rose, fell, rose again. There were dissonances that didn't resolve right away, pauses where words could have fit, but didn't need to. When he finished, the last note hung in the air like a held breath. What's it called?
She asked, voice thick. Second movement, he said after a moment.
Because the first part of my life ended when that rig came down, when Leon died, when I thought the music was over. This, us, teaching, Audrey, you. It's not the same piece, but it's part of the same symphony. She kissed him softly. Promise me we won't let it stop, she murmured against his lips. Even when it's hard, even when people misunderstand, even when we're tired.
I promise, he said. Outside, the city hummed its usual song, sirens and engines and snatches of distant music from bars and apartments and car radios. Life went on, indifferent and immense. Inside the small circle of lamplight around the piano, Henry and Ingrid and Audrey wrote another line of their shared melody. It wasn't perfect. It was honest. And as Henry's scarred hand moved once more across the keys, he understood something he hadn't been able to name at 21, that some songs aren't meant to be performed in glittering halls, preserved as flawless recordings. Some songs are meant to be played in living rooms and lobbies, in community centers and parks, by hands that have been broken and mended, by people who have lost and found and lost again. Songs that change as the players do, gathering new meanings, new harmonies, new courage. Starlit Promise had begun as a love letter from a boy with wild hair and brilliant hands. 16 years later, it had become something else. A bridge between the past and the future, between grief and grace, between a janitor who refused to stop playing and a CEO who finally remembered how to listen. And somewhere, in the quiet place where music goes when it leaves the air, it felt, for the first time in years, like a promise kept.